This is a Locust. It's small, short-lived, and annoying. This is an M22 Locust. It's small, short-lived, and annoying, if we're talking about a certain video game. One of them has killed millions. The other one is a tank. But let's not forget the last similarity. Both of them can fly. It doesn't take much to imagine the difficulty of making a tank airborne, especially with World War II technology. But the need for such a vehicle did exist at that time, and to many, it had its merits. Airborne operations were new for the Second World War, but their very nature necessitated light equipment and restricted drops to mostly infantry, and vehicles weighing very little, like the quarter-ton truck, for example. Here's the deal, though. Airborne infantry could be effective, but they were often countered by fast-moving reactionary forces, which often had tanks for support. The powers that be, the British, decided that logically the best counter to a tank was another tank. Dropping one via parachute was not possible at the time, but using light tanks like the Tricharch and heavy gliders like the Hamilcar, airborne tank support was theoretically possible. But that initial light tank, the Tricharch, had its problems, chief among them being that it wasn't even designed for air transport in the first place. It had only been cleared for such after the Battle of France, where Britain was declaring that many light tanks were obsolete. The Tricharch was among them. Thus, a combination of limited British industry plus waning interest in light tanks was confounded by airborne units actually desiring a better airborne tank. In 1941, in Washington, D.C., a request was made by the British Air Commission for an American company to come up with a new design. While the United States had no aircraft capable of carrying a light tank yet, a set of guidelines were agreed upon so that the eventual prototype could at least be carried by a Hamilcar glider. 3 companies were chosen to submit a design proposal: General Motors, J. Walter Christie, and the Marmon Harrington Company. The challenge was to build a vehicle within the set of parameters. The most notable included a weight limit of 9 to 10 tons, an armament of a 37mm gun, and a crew of 3. A proposed design from Walter Christie in July of 1941 was too large and rejected, as was a further refinement of that design in November of the same year. It is unknown if GM ever created a design. In the end, then, the design from Marmon Harrington was selected to move to the prototype stage in May of 1941, designated the light tank T9 airborne. The proposed T9 was estimated to have a weight of 7.5 tons without crew, storage, and removable equipment. Its approximate dimensions were to be 138 inches long, 84 inches wide, 66 inches tall. Armament would be either a 37 or 57mm gun in a combination mount with a 30 caliber machine gun. All of this would be in a powered traverse turret that could rotate 360 degrees. As per other early American tank designs, the vehicle would also be armed with, as the Ordnance Department defined it, as many additional machine guns as practical. The crew size would be 2 to 3 men. In August of 1941, a preliminary wooden model was reviewed by Air Corps and Ordnance Department representatives alongside members of the Douglas Aircraft Company. The latter's C-54 Skymaster transport was proposed as the transport aircraft. That said, the tank couldn't ride inside. Its hull would be suspended under the airplane and the turret carried within. This, of course, wouldn't be practical for combat. The C-54 had to land at a proper airfield, and the process of detaching the tank and assembling it would take some time. In any case, the T-9 would eventually be built with special lugs for this underslung purpose. Also in August of 1941, the Marmon Harrington Company proposed that their pilot tank would be powered by a Lycoming aircraft engine using VVSS suspension and metal tracks. Unfortunately, after the completion of the T-9 in May of 1942, a weight problem was quickly discovered. The solution was to remove multiple features, including the power traverse system, the hull-mounted machine guns, and even a gyroscopic stabilizer that was present on the turret weapons. The design was further refined in February of 1942, creating the T9E1. Beyond all the previously removed features, the T9E1 also added a sloped front plate for better protection. This also increased driver visibility due to a larger head cover. The turret was also changed. The addition of another access hatch for a total of 2, the centering of a radio bustle, and an additional periscope for the commander were all much-needed changes indeed. The T9E1 retained the Lycoming O-435T 6-cylinder gasoline engine, which had been adapted from aircraft use. It gave the little vehicle, which weighed almost 7.5 tons with a combat load now, a top speed of 35 miles per hour. A 57-gallon gasoline tank gave the small vehicle a cruising range of 110 miles as well. Two pilot T9E1s were constructed, one for testing stateside and the other for testing in Britain. And after that testing proved satisfactory, Marmon Harrington began producing the little tanks in April of 1943. This continued through February of 1944 for a total of 830 tanks. 260 were later shipped to Britain. Interestingly, during this entire time, the tanks were still classified as T9E1. In September of 1943, the U.S. Army Armored Board released a critical report on the T9E1, stating that it was inadequate in the areas of reliability and durability, and indicating that it would not be able to be successfully used during airborne operations. Thus, the vehicle was never actually used by the United States military for anything more than training. It wasn't until September of 1944 that the vehicles were classified as a limited standard, and only then designated as the light tank M22. While parts were still being manufactured at this point, no new M22s were produced before production finally came to an end in February of 1945. Oh, and I'll take a second here to mention the Fairchild C-82 Packet transport aircraft. While not specifically developed to transport the M22, it was under development at around the same time the M22 was being produced. Initial testing actually proved the M22 could be carried fully assembled within this aircraft, but the C-82 wasn't fully refined or distributed until the end of the war. In any case, it still had to land on a runway to actually unload its cargo, which once again prevented a tactical deployment of the M22. In a moment, we'll take a look at the interior of our M22 Locust, but before we do so, let's look at some interesting things on the exterior of the vehicle here. Something that's really cool about our Locust, and many others that are in museums' collections from what I've seen around the internet, is that this is an early production M22 Locust. How do we know that it's one of the first 27 made? The shape of the head cover here. Early production Locust head covers have this kind of flat design, and the driver can see out through a slit viewport in front of them here. But later in production, Locust viewports were actually changed so that now you have kind of more of a bubble shape here on the head cover and a peephole design, which is like a little steel cork that just falls out and hangs on a chain. Another thing that tells us that this is an early production Locust is the shape of the sand shields on the side of the vehicle, what little there is. Now, early production sand shields have this kind of curved design that we see here, whereas on later Locusts, it was more of a slanted or sometimes just a flat design. We don't exactly know around what serial number that sand shield design changed. However, most photos that we see of Locusts that have the early production head cover have these curved sand shields. Let's now take a look at the vehicle's interior. What does it have? What does it not have? How does one even fit? Well, with a crew of 3, not very comfortably, but let's start in the driver's position. This is your vision slot if you're seated in the driver's position with the head cover closed and no periscope. So it's not all that great. To get a better shot in here, we're going to have to crank open the head cover with a little hand crank that sits over to my right. Anyhow, the driver here has all the usual controls you'd expect in an American tank of this era. He's got 2 handbrakes for steering and stopping, plus the usual clutch and accelerator pedals, which are down here at my feet. Interestingly, the gear shift in this vehicle juts out from the transmission housing horizontally over here to my right, which makes shifting a very awkward movement. In front of me is this crank, which, as you saw, I just used for opening the head cover, and it gives me a more generous view when not in combat. When the cover is closed, I can use a spring-loaded handle, which is mounted up in here, for lifting the view slit on the cover. Now, past the handbrakes, actually inside the vehicle, is a little handle that, when turned, secures or releases the M22's driver's side headlight if it needs changing. There's one of these mounts, you can see it here, on the other side of the tank, and they are covered by exterior plugs when not in use. Lastly, the driver's position actually sports a folding seat back behind me that kind of locks in place once I've climbed down from here in through a turret hatch. You would not want to climb in through this head cover. While it does attempt to make the M22 more comfortable, that seat back that is, it's immediately negated by the obvious lack of legroom. The gunner's position on our M22 Locust at first glance appears a little bit bare bones. He doesn't really have a lot of controls. We've got no electronic traverse system in here like we'd see in a bigger tank. Everything is analog. And quite honestly, the gunner could also be considered a partial loader, as both positions in our turret here could load the 37mm cannon, but the gunner in particular has a box of 30 caliber machine gun rounds sitting right in front of him on the other side of the gun from the 30 cal, which is actually over in front of the commander. That does mean that he has to rub his chin up against that ammunition whenever he looks through our gunner's periscope here, usually an M8 gunner's periscope, which actually moves coaxially with the guns here in the turret. That means that there's no telescopic mount, or at least telescopic sight, excuse me, here in the turret itself. So how do you fire the guns? Well, the controls aren't at your feet like in an M4 medium tank or even some of our light tanks. Rather, they're here on the actual hand cranks for the elevation mechanism and the traverse. So in the case of the traverse hand crank right over here, to fire the 30 caliber machine gun, you first disengage the safety switch, which is on the body of the crank, and then press a button that's up here on the handle. The button is to fire, the safety is again the switch. And the same kind of thing goes for the elevation handle, which is more forward of me here. This is for the 37mm gun. Holding the switch disengages the safety on the 37, and then pressing the button fires the main gun. Since everything in here is analog, though, both the traverse and the elevation systems still work. Our tank can still turn its tiny little turret. Now that being said, the gunner's position is also one of the warmest positions here in the M22 Locust, because right behind him is the M22's tiny little gasoline-fed heater. There isn't really much to cover here in the commander's position in our M22 Locust here. He's got the best view in the tank, that's for sure. Two separate periscopes, one behind him, although technically it could be above my head, and one over here in front of me, both of which are mounted in swivel mounts so they can look 360 degrees around the tank. To the front of the commander's position, down on the floor, is the M22's very, very small escape hatch. And yes, you heard me right, it's an escape hatch, although exiting through that would be very difficult, even in an emergency. Lastly, from our commander's position, we've kind of got a good look at where all the ammunition for the 37mm gun is stored. Between the commander and the loader, there's this box here, which contains 14 rounds of ammunition. Then, to the right of the commander, there should be a larger box. Our M22 is missing its, but it would be containing about 24 rounds of ammunition. And then in front of me here is a box containing 12 37mm rounds, for a total of 50. In the end, the Locust was a noble idea, but it wouldn't live up to the biblical reputation of its namesake. Instead, it would fall far, far short of that. It's well known that the Locust has very little combat history, and none of it with the United States. Its one well-documented use, of course, was Operation Varsity, or the Rhine Crossing. Yet there it had quite frankly an unremarkable showing with the British, whose request had inspired the vehicle in the first place. Let's be honest with ourselves. By the standards of American light tanks, the Locust is quite honestly a dud. It fit the program's requirements, sure, but just because it was the right weight and the right size doesn't mean you could rely on it in combat. Yes, it's small and it's cute, but beyond that novelty aspect and its reputation from a certain video game, the Locust has very few fans. And before you go and rush to your keyboard, keep in mind that your favorite tank doesn't have to be good for you to actually like it. I like the Locust, but part of knowing your history is accepting when something just doesn't work out. Anyway, it should be noted that the idea of an airborne tank didn't actually die with the Locust, though. Here in the States, for example, the M551 Sheridan was designed to be transported by air. In the end, the solution to carrying tanks by air, though, wasn't really the tanks themselves, but rather just the delivery aircraft building bigger planes. Even so, tactically airdropping tanks remains today incredibly difficult.